right. You know, I just had we just had some Maoris come and visit the Yurok tribe. We did this event. It's called Paddle Tribe Water, and there's a Yurok woman. Her name is Amy Cordalis. I actually have an interview with her, but she has a nonprofit that she helps out with called Paddle Tribe Water, and what they do is they have native kids from our tribe. They'll paddle the entire length of the Klamath River, and it's the first time that's ever been done in 100 years because we had dams that had dammed up the entire Klamath for the past 100 years. And so what Paddle Tribe Water does is they partner with indigenous nations from other places around the world, and the kids from our tribe will go and they'll paddle on the rivers where those indigenous people want to take down dams, and then those people will come and they came and they paddled down our river. And so there were some Maoris who have a dam they're trying to remove, and they came over and paddled the river for the first time.
Nice, nice.
Although I do know, reading up on the history, it sounds like there's some touchy history with the Maoris and the Morioris.
Moriori, yeah. Yeah, well, yes, but it's only, there were 2 tribes out of 100, you know, that came over here. So it's not all of Māoridom are to be held account for what happened. And yeah, so we can cover a little bit of that during our talk as well. But you know, it's interesting because you know, like indigenous peoples in most colonized lands around the world, Moriori are the indigenous people here, and we've been colonized by 2 Māori tribes. Well, there's only one left and went back to New Zealand. The other left too, but then they got all the land given to them by the native land court in some dodgy deal. And so we find ourselves, Moriori, in the position of being a minority, indigenous people in our own lands, and actually suffering the same kind of prejudice from a colonizer who just happens to be indigenous as well, but indigenous to New Zealand. So that's quite an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah.
Of history, and you know, the prejudice that we have to put up with in some respects down here on the island is worse than what Māori have to put up with from Europeans in New Zealand. So you know, that's quite an interesting scenario.
Yeah. Well, do you want to start by maybe giving yourself an introducing yourself to the Drum Circle News audience of who you are and what you represent?
Sure. So I'll just give a little introduction in you know, both Moriori and Māori, to introduce myself. So firstly, karahi Timihi Kiako, Dylan, greetings to you. Ko Auraki Te Mauka, ko Rēkohu Te Motu, ko Kopinga Te Marae Tapu, ko Manukau Te Tūranga Waiwai, ko Tame Horomona Rehe, Tuku Rapuna, ko Māui Solomon aho. So, ko Moriori me ngai tahu toku imi. So just basically what I said there, Dylan, is that introduce myself in relation to, you know, my geography, my tribal landscape. So I come from 2 tribes, Moriori, from Rēkohu, Chatham Islands, and Rēkohu's 800 kilometres east of New Zealand, small island. And I'm also Ngai Tahu on my Māori side from the South Island in New Zealand. And so my introduction, I introduced my mountain, which is Aoraki, my island, which is Rēkohu, my place to stand, my land is Manukau, and now also Kaiara. My marae, my traditional meeting house, is Kopinga. My ancestor, my grandfather is Tama Moriori, or otherwise known as Māui Solomon. And yeah, my name is Māui Solomon. So yeah, that's who I am.
Amazing. And so you're Moriori, am I saying that correctly? Moriori. All right. And so they're indigenous to the Chatham Islands off the coast of New Zealand.
Yeah, so my ancestors, my Moriori ancestors, are Polynesian, like Māori, and so they settled these islands, roughly 800 to 1,000 years ago. There were several waves of waka or voyaging canoes that brought our people here, my ancestors. Firstly, from eastern central Polynesia, the Rongamai Whenua people, and then there were later canoes, probably 700 or 800 years ago, most likely that came from mainland New Zealand. But at a time before either Moriori or Māori had evolved into our cultural identities, we were still just Polynesian peoples. So, you know, we come from the Polynesian family. So whether you're from Māori from New Zealand, Moriori from Rēkohu, Chatham Islands, whether you're from the Cook Islands, Samoa, Hawaii, Tahiti, we all have that same Polynesian origin. And if we go back far enough, 6,000 or 7,000 years, we actually connect back to the indigenous peoples, the hill tribes of Taiwan. And it probably goes back further from there. So we're all part of that big Polynesian family. So my people settled here, as I say, 800 to 1,000 years ago, and they outlawed warfare and killing and cannibalism, and they learned to live in peace with one another for many, many centuries, which is fairly unique amongst Polynesian peoples around in the Pacific, and probably unique in the world, particularly for how long, 600 to 700 years they observed this peace covenant. And the law was, if there was a conflict between two people, you could fight with a wooden staff called a tupuare, about the height of a man, double thickness of the thumb, and the first abrasion of skin or drawing of blood, fighting was to cease. And so, yeah, the people obeyed that covenant, and it was passed down from one generation to the next. And that was a way of living in this island, peacefully, and learning to share the resource of the land and the sea, and living in relative harmony with the other creatures that my ancestors shared these islands with. And because it's an island, it's about 90,000 hectares. So although it's small, it's a reasonably large size for an island, and it supported be about between 2,500 and 3,000 people. Excuse me. And they were largely dependent on the resources of the sea. So they predated on seals and whales that stranded. There's a lot of fish, shellfish. They lived off the birds of the forest and also seabirds. They went out to offshore islands from here and specially designed canoes that they built from local materials. And of course, there's really big seas around Rēkohu, around the Chathams. We sit on the 44th parallel latitude, and so it's called the Roaring Forties. So you get the seas that come straight up from Antarctica. So the seas can be pretty rugged. But they built these special canoes, which would be of interest for your people because you're a canoe people, that were designed to have water flowing through the hull of the canoe to keep it stable in the high swell conditions that they found around the island. So yeah, they developed and evolved a unique culture here on Rēkohu, and they lived in communities of up to 30 or 40 individuals around the whole of the island. Every part of the island was occupied. There's a smaller island just southeast of the main Chathams called Rangihauti, or as it's known today, Pitt Island. And there were as many as 300 or 400 people who lived over there as well. And so, yeah, they developed a lot of different rituals of greeting. Whereas Māori have the haka, which you've probably heard about. You see the made famous by our national rugby team, the All Blacks. They do the haka, and that was a challenge. Māori would do it, a challenge from when they engaged or met with one another. Whereas Moriori sort of set that aside, and they had different rituals of engagement, which was based more on recitation of what we call hokapapa or genealogy, and also karakia or prayers. So that was the way that Moriori over here greeted themselves, and that was a way of cementing their peaceful way of living, and also connecting through genealogy, reaffirming and strengthening those family bonds and relationships with one another. And it worked very successfully until outsiders arrived upwards of 200 years ago.
Yeah, that's very interesting history, and you know, I'm especially interested to hear about the vow of peace that you guys have taken, and how you stood by that even through many attacks. But before we jump into that, you know, I was curious, do you know if you have any histories of why your people went to the Chatham Islands in the first place?
You mean before Moriori?
Before Moriori, yeah. Before that.
No, well, Moriori were the first people to settle here. So there were, yeah, that's, so whether, what our...
What I mean to clarify, I mean, so you were originally in New Zealand mainland, right? Or what is called now New Zealand, but you're on the mainland, and then yeah.
So you've heard the myth that Moriori were on mainland New Zealand and got driven out to Rēkohu.
So it's a myth. Okay. All right.
And I've spent the better part of my life, which is over 40 years now, dispelling that myth, because Moriori weren't, as Moriori, we weren't in New Zealand and got driven out to Rēkohu by Māori. That is a myth that was developed by Pākehā, by European historians, in about 1900, and they used that myth to justify decolonisation and dispossession of Māori in New Zealand, because supposedly Māori had colonised and dispossessed Moriori in New Zealand. That did not happen in New Zealand. It happened here on Rēkohu, but not in New Zealand. So according to our traditions, there were two streams of migration to Rēkohu. Firstly, directly from the Pacific, not via Aotearoa. So they arrived, they were here, and then later canoes arrived. So the first canoe in our tradition to arrive here was kahu, and that's about, it could be 800-900 years ago. When he arrives, he finds people already in occupation. That's Ngā Uri o Rongomai Whenua, the descendants of Rongomai Whenua. Rongomai Whenua is our founding ancestor. Kahu stayed, he tried planting his kumara, which is a native sweet potato from New Zealand, well, originally from Peru actually, but it's all over the Pacific. And it wouldn't grow because we're too far south in latitude, it's too cold, too wet, so he left. And then a few hundred years after Kahu, the Rangimata and the Rangihaua wakas arrived. We think they may have come from Aotearoa, from the mainland. But again, I stress they weren't Māori coming down here, they were more Polynesian who had settled in New Zealand, and then for whatever reason they may have come directly here, or they might have come from Polynesia to Aotearoa and then out to the Chathams. They come, they stay, they intermarry with the people who are already here, Ngā Uri o Rongomai Whenua, and these are the people who now we are known as Moriori. So it's a combination of those, the original, what we call koro whenua ake, those who were sprung from the earth. They're the Rongamai whenua people, intermarry with the canoe people who later arrive, and over 500-600 years evolve into the people now known as Moriori. And this, of course, happens all over the world, all over the Pacific. Wherever you go, you evolve and develop your own culture, language, identity, and this is what happened to Moriori. So we are a unique people with our own language, our own culture, our own identity, but we also acknowledge our strong links to other Pacific Island peoples, and including Māori. And in fact, just last year, in fact, almost exactly 1 year ago, the remains of a voyaging waka canoe were discovered on the north coast. And that aligns with one of our traditions, the rangi hoa waka voyaging canoe, which brought some of our ancestors here, was wrecked on the north coast when it arrived about 800 years ago. And it was arrived this time of the year, July, August, and it was smashed and buried. And now it's come out of the sand dunes. No one even knew it was there, but our ancestors knew it was there because they left the story. But then it had all been forgotten about, and we had the colonization and genocide that happened here. So we have been excavating that waka, and it's quite incredible. It's the most intact voyaging canoe that's ever been discovered in the Pacific. And we've found over 450 pieces of this waka, and without doubt, it's the remains of the rangi hoa, and it looks like it's one of the early. Its lashing, the way it's been constructed, suggests that it was made in Polynesia. It's got planked. It's sewn together with sinnet and other things, so it's a planked canoe. Would have carried as many as 80 people.
Wow.
Who were voyaging. So it would have had a house built on it. And of course, Polynesians at that time, we're talking 800 to 1,000 years ago, they were at the apex of their sailing and navigational abilities. I mean, they had settled every island in the Pacific Ocean that was capable of being settled by humans over a 3,000 to 4,000 year period. And, this is an ocean that's 35 million square miles. It's vast. It's like colonizing outer space, if you're thinking in those terms. And they did it by sailing, constructing canoes. They had incredible knowledge of astronomy, of the star systems. They knew every star in the sky. They could navigate at night or when it was cloudy. They navigated by the sun, the moon, the stars, the motion of the waves, the movement of birds, signs of seaweed and driftwood, to settle that vast ocean. And I mean, just to give it perspective, if you could put all of the solid Earth inside the Pacific Ocean, and there'd still be room for another continent the size of North America. So it's a massive, massive area of ocean. It is basically, we're the Pacific Island nation, if you will, of Polynesian peoples. So this discovery of this waka, and we think it's actually chosen the time to reveal itself, is an incredible thing, and we hope to be able to. There's more to come out of the sand dunes, and we hope to recreate this voyaging waka in the future, whether we do it digitally, 3D printing and all sorts of things, or we actually reconstruct one. But we're really at the start of that process. So yeah, it's pretty exciting times.
Yeah, it's an incredible history and a story, and I like how you used the words and chose to use the words, saying that you love how this is the time that it decided to reveal itself, and I like the way that you chose those words because it gives life to the story. It gives life to the way that we view a canoe being its own living thing, at least for Yurok, and I'm assuming that for your culture as well, that you view those vessels as living.
Oh, look, absolutely, absolutely. And I had the privilege and the honour of sailing on a traditional voyaging canoe from New Zealand to Rēkohu in 2017. The name of the canoe is Ngā Hiraka Mai Tāwhiti. It's only 52 feet in length, and there were 13, I think 14 of us on board. You know, we encountered some, it took 4 or 5 days and nights, and it was all sailing by traditional star navigation. And we encountered some pretty heavy weather when we were arriving the last 24, 35 hours or so. You know, the 4-meter swells, 25, 30 knot southwest winds. So she was pretty heavy going. But that waka, man, double hulled waka, it handled those seas brilliantly. And so, you know, I got a small kind of insight into what it must have been like for the ancestors. And this is only a small waka. The bigger wakas would have been able to get from New Zealand to here. This is 800 kilometers of ocean in a couple of days in favorable conditions. But the thing is, I felt after that period of time a deep connection to that canoe, to that waka. And it becomes your mother, your everything. And so when the ancestors, for example, arrived, when Māori arrived in New Zealand, a lot of tribes today, like the Tainui people and others, their tribal names come from those original waka that brought them to Aotearoa, New Zealand 1,000 years ago. So that's how important those canoes are. And so, yeah, we have that in common with your people. And, you know, I think there are a lot of similarities. I've been blessed to be able to, in my career my former career as a lawyer representing Moriori, Māori and Indigenous people, to travel around the world and meet Indigenous people in Latin America, North America, you know, Europe and all over. You know, we have so much in common. You know, we share the same spiritual connection to Mother Earth, or as we say, Papa Nunuku, to Tangaroa, the god of the sea, to Ranginui, the Sky Father. And we know we're inextricably linked and connected with all of those things. And in fact, I'll share with you, Dylan, one of our creation stories is our creation story comes from Rangi Tokona was our deity, our ancestor. He was one of the children of Papa Tunuku, the Earth Mother, and Ranginui, the Sky Father. And there just existed this void of darkness, and that all of the children of Ranginui and Papa Tunuku existed in darkness. So one of the children, this is in accordance with Moriori traditional cosmology or cosmogony, Rangi Tokona decided to separate his primordial parents by placing 10 pillars beneath the Mother Earth and Sky Father to let life and light and I suppose love to come into the world. And he did so with in conjunction with his partner and wife, Te Ao Marama. And then to create the first human, because these are deities, they're gods, they're etu or atua. To create the first human, Rangi Tokona heaped up earth in the shape of a tree. And then to animate that human, he took the spirit of a bird, a manu, and placed it in that pile of earth, designed like a tree, and the first human came into existence. So when I think about that, I think about my hokapapa, my ancestral connection is to Mother Earth, because we've come from the earth. We're created in the shape of a tree, and we're animated by the spirit or the modi of a bird. And so that gives you that, for me, that's our environmental philosophy. So I, as a descendant, as a human being, have an obligation to look after the land that I'm on. I have an obligation as Moriori to look after the sea, to look after other species. And so my wife and I, from 2012 up till now, we've been growing and planting native trees on the land here, because it was pretty much, it's been just denuded of all of its trees and forests for sheep and cattle farming over the last couple of 100 years. So to date, we've planted 130,000 native trees.
Wow.
And we hope to bring back the native birds into those forests. And of course, we haven't done it just by ourselves. We've still got jobs and other obligations, but we've had family, friends, even professional planters. We had 50,000 trees we planted last year. So, and that's wonderful to see. You know, some people didn't believe that because it's so windy, the environment here is so harsh, that the trees will grow in these places. But I kind of knew, because the land had spoken to me when I first came down here in my early 20s, that you know, there used to be a forest on this land we're planting on, so they would still have a memory of there being a forest, and so, you know, right tree, right place, and they grow, and it's one of the wonders, it's one of the joys of my life to go and you know, visit those places and see how well those trees are doing, and other people, you know, they're locals and visitors who go into those places, and they see and they feel how the land's now being nurtured and looked after. So yeah, they're all things that are really fundamentally important to me as a Moriori man, I suppose.
Wow. Um, so I recall you talking about how there was people who were already on the island, and they came from the earth, they came out of the earth, and so that's your creation story that you're talking about, is the people who are already on the island were the ones who were made from the trees. But then you also note that the Polynesians came over, which is also a part of your story, and then mixed with those people, and then that's what how the modern Moriori came about. Is that correct in my understanding?
So the yeah, that's a very good question. So Rangi Tokona, not Rangi Tokona, Rongamai Whenua is our founding ancestor. And the Rongamai Whenua people say they were sprung from the earth. And that's possibly from that, and I haven't thought about it in this context until you've just mentioned it now, that, you know, literally sprung from the earth is the creation of Rangi Tokona. So, you know, I've tended to look at it in a sort of mythological context, right? Where you have the creator, I suppose you call it the creator, who created the first, or everything, and there isn't actually a canoe, that we don't know of a canoe that brought the Rongamai Whenua people here, how they arrived here, but they say they sprung from the earth. So it very well could be that you know, that they explain that through the tradition of Rangi Tokona. Whereas I'm sort of looking at it in the sense that every island was in the Pacific was settled by Polynesians on sailing vessels, and I think that's probably what brought the ancestors here originally. But of course, wherever humans have gone, they create, they invent, if you will, believe it or not. You can choose to, the mythology of their creation, how they came to be in that place. So yeah, I kind of like the way that you've intuited, or your insight into that, is Noro Whenua Ake is literally Rangi Tokona, springing that first human from the earth. So yeah, I've learned something myself today.
Yeah. We have our creation story for the Yurok is that the creator gods came down, and there was a primitive version of man, and they showed us how to be humans build plank houses and things of that nature. And so that also falls in line with how our people think of Bigfoot as a race and not as like one singular kind of being that is elusive in the woods, but it's a race of primitive subhumans almost. And so our creation story is that we come from, those are our ancestors that we come from, which the colonizer would call Bigfoot. In our language, it would be a race of people which we would call Uma'a. Yeah, which meant a protector of the woods, but later became known as Indian Devil. But and so yeah, the Bigfoot essentially would be the group of people who decided not to evolve into humans today and decided to stay primitive. And me personally, I like to be a believer in people's creation stories. I think we live in a dynamic world where all things can be true when it comes to creation. There doesn't have to be one finite answer of, oh, we all sprang out of Africa and then migrated everywhere. Because like your people, migration and anthropology, modern days, usually in the context of the white version, and is usually a justification of racial superiority or as a way to justify colonization and the murder of indigenous people. And so I believe that we can all have come from where we come from, and that is where we evolved from. That is our home. That is our birthplace.
That concept that all things can be true at the same time, all of those creation stories. And, I think about, Aboriginal people in Australia and the whole dream time. Wow, they've been like 50 or 60,000 years, and their creation stories are just, fantastic. And the interesting thing, Dylan, and I'm sure you're well aware of this too, because you'd be someone who does a lot of research on a whole lot of things, I'm sure. But I've just been exploring, how science is now starting to come to it. Like physicists are now saying, hey, look, science doesn't know everything, and in fact, science is now starting to just catch up to where spirituality has always been. Where Indigenous peoples have always seen the world and creation, that not everything can be explained in material reductionist terms. There is like quantum physics and entanglement and string theory gives this whole notion that of reality is now being viewed through a different lens, and it's getting to the point where scientists are now starting to view it through a lens that Indigenous people have always viewed life through. There's a greater consciousness, whether you call it the creator or whatever you want to call it, the dream time, and that's actually quite cool, because well, not only cool, I think it's absolutely necessary to our survival as a species on this planet that we reclaim those traditions and our relationship and our interconnectedness with everything else, and that we're not the dominant species. And in fact, according to our tradition, Moriori and Māori and Indigenous peoples everywhere, I'm sure, humans come right down the bottom. We come, our genealogy, we have the rangi tokona as our tuakana, our elder, and we're way down here. So we're not the supreme beings at all.
Yeah, I think how science is just catching up into indigenous ways of knowing and our practices, being that indigenous people are scientists and far more advanced scientists than the Western epistemology version of science is today. And I think the difference is that the way that we view science, or we view creation, or the way we view how to change things in our material world, is that we do it from inside. So our practices, our ceremonial practices, our prayers are the science, are the quantum mechanics as a Western person would describe it. It is us experiencing creation through these ceremonies and creating our world around us, versus in the Western epistemology where they have this separation of subject and object and they have this alienation from nature. They also have an alienation from their inherent internal power. And so instead of recognizing their internal power and then using that to then create within their world, they think that they need to create something in their world externally from themselves. And that's where their science, while it physically may appear to be a lot more advanced, and indigenous people may appear to be not as advanced, because our physical world, it seems a lot simpler. Truly, it is a lot. What we're capable of is more, and that's being demonstrated, in like river restoration, where the Yurok are involved in. And this, a lot of scientists, ecology and biology and engineering, they'll come in and they'll try to physically engineer something, but in the end, the way that indigenous people interact with the land and do restoration has been more advanced than what they're doing today for thousands of years. We just do it on such a simple level that a child can understand and a child can do it. But if you break down the intricacies of what seems to be so simple, can actually be explained on a very deeper level. And that really just comes down to language and how the Western epistemology, how they use language as a tool, as a hierarchical class system to separate themselves. So once they create these languages that have like these scientific definitions that explain every little minute detail, they now feel some superiority above.
No, look, completely agree with everything you've said, Dylan. Completely agree. And I've spent the larger part of my legal career as a advocate and a representative of a number of Māori tribes in New Zealand who were actually challenging that very paradigm that, or saying that, look, Indigenous people's science, if you will, our knowledge, our mātauranga, is equally valid as scientific knowledge, and in fact, in some cases, even above where science is at, because we have a much deeper intuitive understanding. Science actually has to be able to prove every single thing, put it in a test tube and test. And there's a place for that. That's, yes, absolutely, technology and all of those sorts of things. But, we're, as humans, we're not going to evolve through science. We're going to evolve through reconnecting with our true divine being, with our essence, with our spirituality. That's how we're going to evolve as human beings. At the moment, worldwide, we seem to be devolving. We seem to be going back the other way. Yeah. And this is why I have such a deep respect for what my ancestors did here. Even though it cost them dearly, they came to the. And in fact, what's interesting here, Dylan, and I'll share this with you, the ancestor Nunuku Whenua, who created the peace covenant. And the peace covenant was handed down from, way before Nunuku Whenua. So it had been this knowledge that had been passed down through generation. But Nunuku Whenua, about 800 years ago, is credited with coming amongst the warring factions here on the island and decreeing that fighting should cease. Now, Nunuku Whenua lived in a cave. He was like a hermit. And so when I think about that, I think, like some of the great mystics, like whether it's the Buddha or people who become spiritual people, live in caves or they go, and it's a metaphor in a sense for going internally into yourself. But it's said in our tradition he appeared as an apparition between the warring factions, and they were palsied with fear because there's suddenly this bright light in the form of Nunuku appeared, and they were so stunned and amazed, and he decreed that they lay down their weapons, they greet, they hongi, they never fight and kill ever again. And noro whenua ake, no, koro patu, koro kei tangata me tapu tuak. Never again let there be war and killing as this day has seen. And he decreed to people to live in peace, and if they ever break that covenant, may their bowels rot. And the people observed that for hundreds and hundreds of years. But, I think, wow, imagine you're in the middle of a battle and someone comes in right in between the fighting and says, hey, stop. Who's going to listen, right? If you think about it like that, who's going to listen? The blood's up, you're fighting, you're killing. So there must have been something extraordinarily powerful and spiritual I was reading about the Buddha, how he could just transport himself in like a beam of light. And I believe these things are real. I think that there are examples in our history. Jesus Christ was like that. Muhammad was like that. I believe Nunuku was like that. Every culture, every tradition around the world has these beings who are brought amongst us to elevate our consciousnness and our appreciation of the sacred. And that's what happened here on Rēkohu. Either what path you're going to choose, the path of zero-sum game where you're just killing and wiping each other out, or you're going to choose a path of spirituality and peace. And they chose the path of peace. And then in doing that, they became they had karaki, they had prayers for every single thing, rocks, trees, fish. They even had developed this, the most important etu, or gods in, or deities, I'll call them, they're not gods, deities, for Moriori were the shark gods, right? And because there's a lot of great white sharks around the Chathams. And there's not one surviving record of a Moriori ever being eaten by a shark in our traditions, because they were revered as protectors. They were revered as guardians. They weren't revered, they weren't feared as well, I guess they were feared, but they were respected. They had Moriori had a relationship with these beings in the ocean, who are the top predator in the ocean. And you see this all over the Pacific, see it all over the world in indigenous communities. And modern science and the Industrial Revolution and the Renaissance created the separation between humans and our own spirituality, our own connectedness with Mother Earth and the ocean and the skies. And actually, if we are going to survive and evolve as a human species, we need to create that reconnection. And this is the work that you're doing, Dylan, which I totally support and admire you for doing it. And young people like yourself, need to be out there telling these stories because it's important for, I think, the survival for humans on this planet, that we need to reconnect to our true essence.
So what is the definition of peace in your Nunuku?
So we have the word rongo, R-O-N-G-O, rongo, which means peace. Rongo also means to listen, and rongo also means song. So it means peace, to listen, and song. And I think, wow, that's a lovely kind of way of viewing peace, all of those things, because like you're listening to me, so that's an act of peace. I'm listening to you, that's an act of peace. And to really listen to someone is peaceful. And when you're singing, or when you're doing your drum ceremonies, that's that music brings you into a state of peace, and it's a spiritual experience. So rongo is our word for that. And so our founding ancestors, rongo mai whenua, and rongo mai whenua, mai whenua means peace on the earth, and his brother was rongo mai tere, which means peace on the sea. So we come from that very long tradition of peace. That's obviously been passed right down through the many millennia to today, which is now regarded as our most sacred mihiki, our most sacred treasure. And even though, and our people collectively, literally, made the decision not to fight and kill, even if it cost them their lives, and it did. And I've got to be honest with you, Dylan, I've struggled with this throughout my lifetime. Did they make the right decision, you know, and not fighting back? Because they could have, and they would have prevailed because they would had the greater number.
I do want to get into that part of the history, and I'm sorry for interrupting you, but before we jump into that part of the history, which is so incredible, and it's a very interesting story, I want to kind of really get down into the roots of what this peace thing is, and kind of really try to understand it, because it's described as a statement. It's a culture of nonviolence, like you've taken a vow of nonviolence. Right, but nonviolence almost seems like just a final component, and it's really just more of a misnomer, because it seems like it's a culture of a practice of peace, and then the nonviolence is a decision you make later on when confronted with violence. So rather, nonviolence not being the actual practice, peace is what the practice is, and so I think that's amazing, and I was kind of hoping to understand the intricacies of that peace practice, right? And so, if you're in a practice of peace, and it sounds like you settled your differences, like if you had a difference with another man, you could engage in a man-to-man, a friendly battle, if you will, that just wasn't taken to the point of ultimate violence, which would be bloodshed and death. But the fact that as men you still got to the point where you would want to engage in a battle tells me that there is still a strong sense of masculinity within your culture, and a healthy version of that. And so I was hoping to really just understand what your culture's practice or perception is on the masculine and the feminine energy, and how that works in your environment of peace.
Excellent observation and question. And so, yeah, it's that this peace covenant, we call it the peace covenant, Nunuku's peace covenant. And I think you're quite right. It wasn't just about non-violence. It was also a conflict management system. And so, you know, there was a recognition wherever you have two humans, male or female, male and female, whatever, there's going to be some form of conflict, whether it's emotional conflict, psychological conflict, physical conflict. And so Nunuku said, hey, if there's going to be a conflict or a scrap, then grab a couple of sticks and thrash each other. But you're not allowed to kill. And honor is satisfied first drawing of blood or abrasion of skin. And so there was that outlet for aggression amongst, I guess, predominantly it would have been males who fought with these staffs. And the whole peace notion was, I think, evolved in terms of how humans then interacted with each other. So each family grouping or sub-tribal grouping, so a family grouping might be 30 or 40 people, and then a hapu or a sub-tribe might be 100, 120. Each one had their own defined territory that was demarcated by rocks, trees, streams, whatever it might be. And so whenever they met one another, they had these different protocols for greeting and meeting. If you're someone who you'd had a a conflict with that neighbouring group, then there was a ritual of engagement that you went through to lay that all aside. And then there was a sharing of the resources that went on. So they developed a really elaborate system of living in this environment and in this landscape in a very close contact with one another, because we're an island, and it was very successful for 500 years. So I think this is all part of that peacemaking and peacekeeping, the elaborate rituals that were evolved and developed. And as I say, it wasn't just about non-violence, it was a whole way of life. And there's traditions of these, what they call their laws, were placed into stones. So, we read in the old Bible of Moses, going to the Mount Sinai and coming down with the tablets with all the 10 commandments in stone. And so, and I think it's a metaphor for, like, these are immutable laws. Thou shalt not kill. And so our ancestors, in their own way, had developed the system of laws that they held so sacred they placed them into stones. So this is all part of that evolution of a peaceful way of living together. And if someone broke that code, if someone did actually kill another person, they were then ostracized from the collective. They were alienated from the collective. And when you live in a society that's highly, collectivized, like Indigenous peoples are, and you're on your own, you're pretty much finished. And so we have stories of, or one story of a man who broke that code of peace, killed someone, and committed suicide by jumping down a blowhole in the far north of the island. So other aspects of this notion of peaceful living and existence is reflected in our tree art, because Moriori engraved living trees with images of humans with a sort of a heart, typically a heart-shaped head, with a smiley face, adorned with different feathers and things. But there were also seals and fish and birds, and you can see some like kelp beds and fish swimming into it. All of those things were carved on these. So thousands of trees were etched, and it was a way of, I suppose, expressing their joie de vivre, their joy for life. And according to the early colonizers and the settlers, Pākehā, the European settlers who came in the 1820s and 30s and so forth, even though Moriori had been, subject to genocide, and so their morale had been almost completely destroyed. They're recorded as being, once they gained the confidence of these outsiders, they were very joyful people, a very happy people. Spontaneous laughter when Lieutenant Broughton and his men arrived on the brig Chathams. They were heading up your way, actually up to North America. They were sailing up there, and they got blown off course in a storm in November 1791 and ended up here on the Chathams. And they were the first contact that Moriori had with the outside world for hundreds and hundreds of years. But it's recorded in Broughton's diary that there were just spontaneous outbursts of laughter and joy. And so, I see this as part of a manifestation of this kind of peaceful spirituality that they had discovered here on these islands. Now, the counter to that, or the flip side of that, is it's easy for me sitting here in the 21st century with a house and a fire and all of the mod cons and looking through rose-tinted glasses through how it was for my ancestors, and I'm aware of that, and that it would have been also, You know, this is a harsh climate. This is a harsh environment here during the winter. There would have been real challenges for my ancestors here, coming from tropical Polynesia to temperate, cold, you know, almost sub-Antarctic. It would have been a huge challenge. And so, but they adapted, they evolved to live in this climate, and I think they did so very, very successfully. And it's interesting, you know, because the colonizers, the white colonizers, come to say they're going to civilize Indigenous peoples. We're going to give you the attributes of colonization. We're going to educate you. But actually, like the Aboriginal people in Australia, they were actually just happy the way they were. You know, Captain Cook in his diary said they didn't want anything that we had to offer them. The only thing they wanted was for us to leave them alone. You know, and I'm sure Moriori, you know, we'd lived here successfully. There were 3,000 people. There's only 600 today. So actually, who got it right? You know, there were no planes, there were no ships bringing in, you know, we bring in all sorts of supplies from mainland New Zealand. Our ancestors lived on what they had here on the island, what they could get from the sea, what they could get from the forest, what they could grow. So, and that's the same for Indigenous peoples everywhere. So it's kind of, you think, well, actually, who is the more civilized? Who is the more, you know, as human civilizations, human species, who is doing the better job of existing on the planet? You know.
Well, yeah, the colonizers, the Europeans, that's why they call it civil engineering. They had they did amazing building and masonry, and coupled that with the spiritual ego from the Abrahamic religions, and they think they're God's gift on earth, quite literally. And they need to bring that to the Indigenous people, no matter how happy they are with how they're living their lives. So did you guys having a law, having these laws that you written into stone implies that you had a form of law keepers. So what did that look like? For Yurok, we had something called Indian Law Way. What would be your version of that?
So we had tuhuk is our word for it. So they're like a spiritual leader. Nunuku was probably one of he would have been a tuhuk, Iariki, a spiritual leader right up there. And there were many others. So there would have been those people who were the keepers of the hokapapa. Hokapapa is our genealogy, and it was one of the most important things to our ancestors, is to know your hokapapa, where you come from, who you are. And so even, you know, fortunately, we had some of the survivors, some of our leaders who did survive the pogroms and the genocide, were able to write down, you know, some of these traditions and gather some of the knowledge from these tuhuk. Maikaua was one, Tamahi Waki was another one, and they could recite from their memory 180 generations from, you know, the recorder right back to the creation. 180 generations just from memory. So there were special schools, what we call wānanga or wānaka, where these people were trained. And when they first arrived here, there would have been also those who had knowledge of the star navigation, how to navigate. And in fact, there's a compass, a knowledge of weather. And so there were different people, would have been men and women, who had knowledge of certain things that were then passed down to certain students or children or descendants who showed I suppose, some aptitude or some enthusiasm for learning those things. And so the Covenant of Peace, for example, Nunuku's law, was part of a rite of passage for a young person, typically a boy, because they're the ones who would be most involved in physical conflict. So the father would take the son to the tuahu, to the altar, and one of the old weapons of war was on the tuahu. Father would take it, hold it, pass it to his son, and explain how humans used to be. They were killing one another, and but the power over life and death had been taken from the hand of man and placed into the hands of their gods. I'm just giving you the sort of the summary version of it, and then the child would place the weapon back on the tuahu, so they just became ceremonial. So it was passing on this this knowledge, this law, this peace covenant from one generation to another. And so yeah, there were these, and there were all sorts of other laws that governed how people lived on the island.
So, who held people accountable to laws, and who settled disagreements? How did that work?
Yeah. So what we know, and I've got to add a caveat here too, Dylan, that Moriori, the last fluent speaker of our language, died in probably 1900, 1902, and we've been so heavily colonized and remain heavily colonized, even on this island today, not only by Europeans, but by Māori, and now by the whole Chatham Island culture, that Moriori is, even in our own island, it's like I'm probably one of one who's prepared to, sadly, here on the island, to speak out for Moriori and to speak the truth. That doesn't make me popular, but I do it to honor my ancestors, because of that oppression and because of that colonial thinking. But anyway, coming back to the I've lost the thread of what I was talking about. Sorry.
Yeah, well, we're who held people accountable, and
Who held people accountable? So we had councils of elders. So our system was pretty much a flat structure. It was an egalitarian society, community. So, but there were councils of elders, respected leaders in the community who made decisions for the community. And so there were, and they weren't hereditary, like in New Zealand. You have an ariki class, which is hereditary, passed from father to son, etc., etc. Sometimes from father to daughter and what have you. But here it was, if you were capable, then you became a leader. And so it was council of elders who decided who were the regulators, the lawmakers, the law enforcers, if you will, who governed, I guess the day-to-day activities. And for example, when after the Māori invasion, Ngāti Mutunga, Ngāti Tama invasion, 1835, there was 1,000 men are said to have met at a place called Te Awa Pātiki, which is where the big internal lagoon opens to the sea, and that was their sacred meeting place. So all of the leaders gathered there to debate over 3 or 4 days what their response would be. The young men wanted to fight back, as young men would, but the elders, the leaders like Tōria, Tapata, Takarehe, they forbade fighting and killing ever again, because their law was the law of peace, the law of their land, and they would have to transgress that law would have been a transgression with their gods, with their deities, and so but they made that fateful decision. So yeah, it was the elders who, the Council of Elders, who called the shots, if you will.
Do you mind fixing your camera a little bit? Just it has your chin cut off. There we go. I appreciate it. Yeah, no worries. Well, that's incredible. That I always like to hear about when cultures covet the knowledge of elders and allow them to call the shots, if you will. And that I'm assuming that it was not gender based either. You said it wasn't hereditary. Was it gender based? Was it men or was it women, or was it a mixture of both?
That's a very good question, and sadly, the woman's voice in the surviving oral traditions is not totally silent, but you don't hear it much of it. Now, there could be a number of reasons for that, because by the time it was almost a generation after the invasion and after the genocide that these traditions, oral traditions, came to be written down. So, 95% of our people had been decimated, right? There's one instance, for example, on a beach here at Waitangi, where 90 men, women, and children were staked alive, laid out on the beach and staked alive, and then cooked up in a hangi, an underground oven, by Ngāti Mutunga, Ngāti Tama, which is horrific. So we don't know what leadership role that women played. I'm pretty certain they would have, because if you're talking about a peaceful, egalitarian society, why wouldn't female energy, the female spirit, have an equal role in that society?
Right.
It just doesn't make sense to me that they wouldn't. And in fact, that's reflected in our decision in 2005 when we opened our traditional meeting house, Kopinga Marae. We had this debate amongst ourselves. Should women, because traditionally only men would speak on the marae, in New Zealand. We weren't sure if women spoke on our marae, on our meeting house. But we put it out to the vote of our people. 95% said, yes, women should have a right to speak if they wish to, because women today perform leadership roles, and why would you deny them that right? And that's the sort of thing I tend to look at Moriori philosophy and society as one that was very inclusive, very open to new ideas. It wasn't sort of just stuck in a rut. It didn't exist in a vacuum. It continued to evolve. So yeah, sadly, I can't really give you a full answer about the role that women played in a leadership capacity, other than to say I believe they would have, because women have a different way of looking at the world. And in fact, we probably need to, in my experience as a professional, and even growing up, my mother is probably the hero in my life story. So I'm someone who really greatly admires and respects the female energy and its importance to, as a counterbalance to the more sort of aggressive tendencies of the male energy.
Yeah, I definitely hear you. I believe that men have more of a control or rule over the physical world, while the feminine energy is more of a spiritual. They have more of a spiritual leadership, and there definitely needs to be a balance, in my opinion, of the two. Yeah, so that's incredible. I really love that history, and I like to get in there in the intricacies, because I like to kind of get a full understanding of how people or how our culture operates, and so yeah, that's beautiful. So now we can get into the nitty gritty. All right. So you guys have this culture of peace, and then the Maori come from New Zealand. They land on your coast, and it sounds like that was a near genocide and enslavement of your people. Could you break down that history?
Excuse me, yes. So you have two Māori tribes, Ngāti, Tama, Ngāti, Mutunga, from the west coast of the North Island, about in the middle of the island, a place called Taranaki. And they had migrated in about 1820. They'd migrated from Taranaki to Wellington. And Wellington is sort of like the capital of New Zealand, with another tribe, and they displaced the Māori tribes who were in Wellington, who were the original inhabitants of that area. Of course, we're talking at a time now where guns had been introduced into the equation.
Oh, so this was not that long ago. Okay.
Oh no,
This is like mid 1800s, right?
yeah.
Okay.
And so Europeans had already arrived on the scene. Māori were a very martial, very warlike people. They were fighting one another, had been for centuries.
Well, so who landed on Moriori's island, the Chatham Islands first? Was it the European colonizers, or was it the Maori? Who got there first?
So the first outsiders to arrive were Europeans in 1791.
Okay, let's start there then, and then we'll get into the other.
1791.
Yeah.
Could I just have a 2-minute break to get a glass of water?
Oh, yeah, of course. Go ahead. I'll grab some water too. Yeah.
So just talking about the when the first sort of colonizers arrived. So we have in November 1791, Lieutenant Broughton, sailing on the brig Chatham, was sailing with Captain George Vancouver, and that name will be very familiar to you. They were sailing around, they were in Dusky Sound, which is deep part of the South Island of New Zealand. They were heading back to Tahiti, and they got separated in a storm. And on 29th of, excuse me, on the 29th of November, 1791, Broughton, one of Broughton's men, observed some land which wasn't on the charts. So it turned out to be Rēkohu, Chathams. And so they landed, came on board with a little rowboat, captain and his men.
These are Spaniards?
Hello?
These are Spaniards?
No, English.
Oh, English, the English. Okay.
English, yeah.
All right.
And so they interact with Moriori on the beach. Moriori or the ancestors think they've come from the sun. They refer to them as the sun people because, I don't know, that, and you can imagine it would be like us watching an alien ship arrive. There's the ship with these big sails and people dressed in strange looking clothing. Anyway, there was a bit of a misunderstanding on the beach, and one of the Moriori men, Tama, he was shot and killed by one of Broughton's men, and Broughton says, that they were becoming aggressive, so one of them was shot, and the Moriori story was that Broughton's men were wanting to take one of their nets out of the canoes as a souvenir, and the sort of fight developed, and that's, whatever misunderstanding, whoever was right, the rights and wrongs of it, the colonizer had paid their first visit, shot and killed a Moriori. They sailed around another part of the island, landed, nailed a lead plaque to one of the trees, proclaiming ownership of the island in the name of King George III, drank a toast, and then sailed off. So, they were only there for like less than a day. But, I just sort of think the hubris of it, that they can, of course, is what colonizers did wherever they went. They can just claim someone else's land, clearly, already occupied.
Yeah.
Oh, we discovered this island. All you discovered is that it had already been discovered.
Yeah.
Hundreds and, in your case, thousands of years beforehand. So they then sailed off, and the Chathams, and they renamed the island Chatham after the ship. So Chatham Islands then became marked in the royal charts, seafaring charts, admiralty charts is what they're called. So then, when the whaling and sealing began in the 1807, I think, when sealing first sealing ship arrived here, and then whaling ships started coming later. So there were a lot of Europeans sealing and whaling ships stopping here, and there's no record of there being any violence between Moriori and those early sailing and sealing gangs and ships. So there was obviously a peaceful interaction. Excuse me. But in 1834, a Māori had come on a whaling ship to the island, and he then went back to his people in Wellington, Ngāti Mutunga, Ngāti Tama, who at that stage were wanting to leave Wellington, and they were thinking of getting a ship and invading Samoa or another island down this way, Norfolk Island. But this guy had been to the island Chathams on a whaling ship, told them about this island with heaps of food, people of peace who didn't know how to fight, was how he put it. So they decided to commandeer an English sailing ship in 1835, and they came in 2 shiploads. Both Ngāti, the first to arrive was Ngāti Tama, and there's about 450 of them, men, women, and children. And so they were brought down here in what I think was like a mercenary run, in an English sailing ship. They didn't come here on a canoe or anything. They came on a sailing ship. They wouldn't have got here otherwise. When they arrived, because it took a long time for them to voyage here, they were packed like cattle into the hold of the ship. There wasn't much food or water, so they were very dehydrated, very ill from the long trip, and had Moriori been a violent people, could have easily overwhelmed them, killed all of them immediately upon arrival. But their Moriori custom was one of peace and to look after people, and they'd been looking after sealers and whalers who had been coming and then going, and they just assumed that this ship who brought these people from New Zealand, they called them New Zealanders, these Māori, were just going to stay temporarily and then leave. So they fed them, they nursed them back to health, they looked after them, and as soon as they got their health back after 2 or 3 weeks, Ngāti Tama people began to walk the land. These Māori began to walk the land, killing Moriori as they went.
So the Moriori healed these people, and then back to health, and then instead of them being grateful, they just started murdering your people.
Exactly.
Wow.
And so, meanwhile, another shipload, Ngāti Mutunga, arrived on the same English sailing ship. And long story short, they began to what's called takahi, to walk the land. And this was, I suppose, to be fair to them, this was consistent with their own traditions up in New Zealand. This is what they did. They'd done the same thing in Wellington. They'd decimated, they'd killed and wiped out all the local tribes in Wellington on the mainland. And so they were doing down here the same as what they were doing up in New Zealand, except they weren't doing it to another Māori tribe. They were doing it to a different people altogether, because Moriori were not Māori. We're a people of peace, and they knew we were a people of peace. And so, it was like taking like slaughtering sheep. And that's actually one of the terms that our ancestors used. They slaughtered us like sheep. Not only slaughtered them, they cannibalized them.
All right. So my bad. That was like such a horrible spot for the battery to die on. So the Maori, their practice was to not only their practice was to cannibalize people as well. So they went around and they murdered the indigenous people who were non-Maori, and they would eat them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it was up in New Zealand. This was like, it was a tradition to eat the enemy as a not all of them, but the tradition was to enslave, and there'd be certain of the chiefs from the opposing side that you'd conquered, you eat them in a ritualistic manner. But down here, there were no such rules. Men, women, and children were just cannibalized and eaten, and was just there was no. The problem is, and this is when the island is so far from New Zealand, there were no kind of other neighboring tribes or other groups. Even though there were Europeans here, they were cowed. They weren't going to interfere to stop what was going on. It was just lawlessness. And so Moriori could see what was happening. It was pretty clear the direction this was heading. So that's when 1,000 men went and met at Te Awapātiki and debated over 3 or 4 days what their response would be. And as I said earlier, the young men wanted to fight back. The elders forbade it. So they said, no, we are going to renew our efforts to offer peace and to share the resources. And that was rejected. And so Moriori were enslaved. Not only were they enslaved, but men were separated from women, fathers from sons, children from parents. They were forbidden to speak their own language. They were forced to do labor. They were starved, maltreated. It was terrible what happened, and no one was doing anything about it. And this went on for one whole generation. So from 1835, slavery down here on Rēkohu wasn't abolished until about 1863, almost 30 years after the invasion. And yet slavery had been abolished in New Zealand in about 1830, 1835 had been, So the colonial government in New Zealand, which was established in 1840, 5 years after the invasion, they knew what was happening down here, but they didn't do anything to intervene because they were too busy stealing land of Māori up in New Zealand. And so our population went from about 2,000 people in 1835, and by 1870, the census shows there was only 101 full Moriori of full blood left. So yeah, it's what happened here was genocide, and it's been a story that has been swept under the carpet largely in New Zealand history. It's like Moriori, as Al Gore once said about the climate. We've been an inconvenient truth to our nation's history, and to a large extent we still are.
It is a very inconvenient truth, I will say, because it's so frustrating, right? You'll always hear these justifications from the European colonizer saying that indigenous people were nothing but a bunch of warring tribes who were eating each other, who were enslaving each other way before the colonizers even got here. Their whole justification is that they were conquerors and that they just happen to be stronger than us and we were a savage people. And I'm always trying to, every time I hear this, I'm just like, what are you talking about? Native people do not do this. And this is like the story where you're hearing, well, there is a native group that is engaging in this same kind of European colonizer savage behavior that kind of negates the story that we're trying to tell about ourselves as the majority of Native people, which is that we're largely a peaceful group of people.
I think that's it's the myth or the story that you mentioned right at the start of our conversation was that Moriori were in New Zealand and driven out to the Chathams, which is a myth, was created by Europeans to justify their dispossession of Māori in New Zealand. But they didn't want to deal with what happened between Moriori and Māori here on the Chathams, because the colonizer, the European colonizer, in 1870, they set up a native land court, and they gave, even though Ngāti Mutunga and Ngāti Tama had gone back to Taranaki, these two Māori tribes had gone back to Taranaki, their traditional home in New Zealand, the colonial government, the Pākehā government, gave 98% of our land to the invaders, even though they'd gone back to their traditional home. Wow. They didn't want them back in Taranaki because the colonial government were busy stealing land of Māori in Taranaki. So they said to Māori, you go back to the Chathams, we'll set up a court there, we'll give you all the land. And this is exactly what happened. Even though Moriori were again, even though our population had plummeted, we were still again a majority population. So we got done over by both Māori and by the colonial European government. Mm-hmm. And our people, my ancestor Herawana Tapu, had written this powerful petition to Governor George Grey in 1862. George Grey was the colonial governor of New Zealand, and seeking justice from, the English system, because the missionaries who had come down here said, "Oh, look, write to the government in New Zealand, and they'll come and set things right down here." They did completely the opposite, and so, having lost their life, their liberty, their language, they then lost all their land because the colonial government gave it to the recent invaders. And again, they did that because it was politically convenient to do it. And so that really, in many ways, that was the last, it was thought to be the last nail in the Moriori coffin, because when my grandfather, Tama Horomonarehe, died in 1933, at his eulogy, at his graveside, they said, "Oh, now he's gone, the race is extinct." So then immediately, the newspapers picked up, the media, Moriori were extinct. When I was at school, "Oh, you're extinct. There's no Moriori." Or we never existed. We had just become a historical fiction because it was too hard for both Māori and the colonial government or the government to accept what had happened down here, because it was a stain on the nation on the conscience of our nation. And so in 1979, my older brothers and sister, Margaret and Charles Solomon, they came down to the island to sort of, have you seen that movie Roots?
I haven't seen Roots.
You haven't? Okay.
I'm sure there's plenty of people watching that have seen Roots, though. So.
It's about tracing, African American history back to their roots in Africa. So Margaret and Charles were who lived up in New Zealand. They came back to trace their Moriori origins. So that documentary was screened in 1980. And then my family had a reunion, Solomon family reunion in 83, 84. That's when I first got involved. And we decided to put up a memorial of our grandfather, Māui Solomon, as the last Moriori of full blood. Because we'd all been colonized in our thinking that Moriori have ceased to exist. But now I just think that's so ludicrous now, because I'm Moriori, but we've been so colonized in our thinking, there's no full-blooded Moriori, and therefore Moriori don't exist. We're extinct. But I sort of partly jokingly say to people now, well, actually, there are still full-blooded Moriori. You're talking to one. And they go, but hold on, you told us you're Māori and you're Moriori and you've got English, Irish, German, French. I said, yeah, but I'm Moriori and I'm full of blood. So I'm full-blooded Moriori, right?
I like that description.
Yeah. And because this whole blood quotient thing, Dylan, as you're probably well aware, it was created by the colonizer to diminish. Oh, you're a half caste, or you're a Métis, or you're something. So you don't have that. You're only half a human. You don't even really qualify. And so
I definitely struggle with that. It's a big conversation and struggle down here on our side of things. And I'm obviously mixed. My mother is non-native, and my father, he's native. And I got my mom's skin tone, and I love my mother. She's incredible. I'm happy to have her skin tone. But at the end of the day, you get it on both sides. You get the natives who are darker and they hold themselves up higher because they have the skin tone of their ancestors, and then you got the colonizer telling you like, oh, you need to have this much of whatever to be considered native. But at the end of the day, if you have a connection to your land, you're on your ancestral homeland, and you have a connection to your ancestors and your culture, that right there, that is being indigenous, that is being native.
Yeah, exactly. And this is why, like in New Zealand now, you just, as long as you've got, like Māori say whakapapa, we say hokopapa, a genealogical connect, you can point to an ancestor who was Moriori or Māori, then you qualify. Even if you're a 164th, you still can register as a Māori or as a Moriori. That's just, and that's giving primacy, I suppose, to genealogy or to hokapapa. So, so Granddad died in 1933. He had a Māori wife from Ngāti in the South Island, and so after Granddad died, my father was the eldest son of Tommy, and he had 5 children. 4 survived to adulthood. So just from my grandfather alone, there are over 400, probably 450 of us, just from my granddad. And there are a lot of other Moriori families. So we then decided to set up, a tribal trust. And over the last 40 years, we've kind of been very active in re-establishing, reclaiming our identity and some of our resources here on the island. I've moved back here in 2010. But for most of my legal career, I was a legal advocate for Moriori in the courts and in the Waitangi Tribunal, arguing to re-establish our fishing and land rights. Recently, we signed in 2020, we signed a settlement with the New Zealand government, and who apologised and offered us a few dollars in compensation. Not a lot, but it was something. And an agreed historical account, and we got some of our traditional lands back. But we hadn't sort of sat back and waited for the Crown to do it. We've been doing it ourselves for the last 30 years in terms of raising funds and building our marae and buying back land and and re-establishing, our own status here on the island. So we've got the what I often say now, Dylan. We've got the hardware, we've got the land, we've got the marae, we've got physical resources, but the software is the most important thing. That's the language, the prayers, the songs, the traditions, the stories, and that's going to, that really is the most important part of what makes you
Yeah.
an Indigenous person. Is, it's easy to say I am such and such, but what are you doing? How many stories do you know? Can you speak your language? Can you sing your songs? Can you say your prayers? Do you know your hokapapa? They're all the important things. That's the software. So that's the important work that now needs to be done by our people to fully reclaim and actually to understand our peaceful history. And I think for Indigenous peoples, Moriori would probably be probably on only the bottom rung, or rung 2 of 100 rungs of reclaiming who we are. I know a lot because I've dedicated my whole life to it, but I'm one of a very few. But I hope by the time I pass that, there'll be, and I see signs of it happening now, younger people coming through, taking an interest in and pride in being Moriori, because for so long, people didn't want to identify as Moriori because we were said to be inferior to Māori. We were said to be weak. We were said to be subhuman, even. It was written by the European. Oh, they didn't fight back because they're subhuman. They're not intelligent. They're weak. They're inferior. So all of this stigma was associated with being Moriori. So a lot of our people, and we were slaves, right? So a lot of our people who survived, who had to then leave the island and go to live in New Zealand because we didn't have any land, it was given away by the colonial government, intermarried with Māori and European communities and deliberately set aside their Moriori identity. So it was lost. We call those people the missing voices. So we've spent the last 20 or so years, 30 years trying to rebuild and reestablish connections with all the threads, the diaspora that happen. And it's heartening for me to see that is happening, and people are now standing proud to be Moriori and learning their language, learning the stories, learning the prayers, the songs. That brings me great comfort and joy. And I remember when I was a young fellow, I was 23. I'd just been made the chair of our of this statue committee to put up a statue of my granddad. I just got a job as a lawyer in Wellington, a law clerk, and I'd spend some weekends, it was raining and wet, I'd go to the National Archives, or to the library, and I'd read all I could about Moriori history, because there was a lot that was written, because we were an extinct race, we were a dying race. There seemed to be this unusual interest in Moriori back in the 18th, 19th century. So, but what I learned about this covenant of peace, and I thought, wow, a people who were a warrior people who set aside killing, warfare, and cannibalism and learnt to live in peace for over 500 years, they're not an inferior people. They're not a weak people. And that's what I'd grown up being taught at school, that Moriori are weak and inferior and didn't deserve to survive. And so I thought to myself, wow, my ancestors have got a really bad rap. Despite everything that happened to them was terrible, but actually the physical things that happened, but it's actually the non-physical things, the way they've been written out of history, the way they've been mischaracterized in history. So at a very young age, I made a promise to my ancestors. I can remember sitting in this National Archives saying, right, I'm going to do all I can in my lifetime to have your story told, to have your truth told, and to have the world learn about, this ancient covenant of peace that Moriori, rather than being a weak people, I think it takes greater strength of character and to respond in a peaceful manner than it does to respond in violence. So I saw what my ancestors did was highly evolved as human beings in this island, and they lived very successfully. And so that's kind of what I've been, coupled with my legal advocacy. I've also, I guess, been a cultural advocate, still am. That, you know, down here on the island, it doesn't make me popular because we're only a minority on our own island. And so I've made a lot of enemies, particularly from a lot of the Ngāti Mutunga fundamentalists. But I also believe that, you know, the Moriori way is the only way for people to ultimately live as human beings, is to learn to live in peace and to learn to share the resources and be respectful of one another, you know. So anyway, that's kind of a little summary of my journey.
It's been an incredible conversation, and I really enjoyed the history of your people. I really appreciate you taking your time out of your day and your schedule to have this conversation with me. I hope we can stay in connection, and you know, I'd love to follow where your culture expression goes and where you take this knowledge and how that develops. I'd like to follow that. And for people who enjoyed your conversation and your history, where could they find stuff about what you're doing?
So we have, if they were just to type in Moriori, Google Moriori, would take them to, that we've got, there's YouTubes. Yeah, there's a lot of information. Hokotehi Moriori. I could actually send through a few links, Dylan. I think I might have actually already. So, but yeah, just Google Moriori. I think would be probably the easiest way, either on YouTube or on Google. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But look, I just want to say too that it's been a real pleasure to talk to you, Dylan, and to learn a little bit. I'd love to learn more about your people, and if my wife and I or kids are ever in California, you'll be one of the first people I'm going to come and visit. I'd love to come and visit.